Good morning and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Abbas Kadhim, Director of the Iraq Initiative, and we are here to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the Yezidi genocide in Iraq. 10 years ago, a terrorist group calling itself the Islamic State in Iraq and Sham attacked the northern Iraqi province of Nineveh and moved to other provinces in a matter of days. Part of that attack, they devastated one of the most peaceful communities in the Middle East. Men were slaughtered, women, old, children were put in mass graves, and many young women were kidnapped and put into slavery. A barbaric practice at all levels, all in the name of Islam. As we stand today, 10 years later, we want to reflect on two things, not just to remember those painful events, but also to look at ways and measures that would restore whatever left of life to this community that deserves a new start and deserves a place to live in with dignity and prosperity in their native homeland, their native cities that they have lived in for more than any other Iraqi can claim to live in that part of the world. We also, more importantly, would like to put our intellect together to think about a very important aspect whenever we talk about genocides, talk about atrocities, and talk about devastation to human communities, is how to ensure that what happened never happens again. And this takes a collective effort from the international community, from the Iraqi government, from Iraqi people, from everyone who loves peace and loves humanity around the world. What we are here is really to make a moral statement more than only a political statement and a social statement. At the end of the day, we are, as a human body on this earth, under the obligation of moving away from the wounds and the barbaric methods of the past to something that is worthy of our humanity, to live together, to coexist, and to help each other reach prosperity, live together rather than die together. That is where we are trying to go with this painful memory and painful anniversary that we are commemorating. I am honored to say that we have here the Honorable Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, representing our own U.S. State Department. Thank you very much, Madam Undersecretary, and thank you to all our guests, to all our speakers, and to our partners, the Free Yezidi Foundation. And I am honored to introduce Perry Ibrahim, who is going to give some introductory remarks before we all listen to you, Madam Undersecretary. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, thank you for joining us today for this somber event. And I thank Dr. Abbas and our friends and colleagues at the Atlantic Council for their support in making sure we remember. We mark 10 years since ISIS launched a genocidal campaign against the Yazidi people. We are here to remember and to point to many shortcomings in recovery and to present some tangible solutions. ISIS made clear why they came to destroy. According to the ISIS ideology, it would be a stain on every Muslim if Yazidis continue to exist. This was not the first time our people have been attacked. Throughout history, our people have been persecuted. It seems that history is repeating itself because prevention seems elusive. Yazidis live in constant fear. Neighboring communities do not eat our food. Many in Iraq see us as infidels, not worthy of any existence, as devil worshippers, and the discrimination runs deep. It is multi-generational. When extremists like ISIS emerge, they draw from that well of hatred. Iraqi citizens from all ethnicities and religions must not be silent. We all need to stand up loudly and publicly to combat deep-seated prejudice. The louder the voices of tolerance and mutual respect, the harder for extremism to take hold. 10 years ago, on 3rd of August 2014, ISIS committed unimaginable crimes against our people. Girls, children, were raped and forced into unthinkable life of sexual slavery. Men and older women were killed. And some of the atrocities are too horrific to mention. And now 10 years later, more than 2,600 Yazidis are still missing. And we know that some were killed by ISIS, but we also know that some are alive. I went to Al-Hol camp. The authorities there are not equipped to identify Yazidis and rescue them. Sometimes Yazidis who are identified and are extracted from Al-Hol camp live in fear. Sometimes we find missing Yazidis in Turkey. Turkey has created a permissive environment for extremists for many years, including the Islamic State. In our meetings with the US State Department, the Department of Defense, and White House, our delegation is calling for a task force to bring home our women and girls, those that are still alive and remain enslaved. And the remains bring back home the remains of those that we are still missing. A comprehensive multinational effort should be established to locate and rescue missing Yazidis. 10 years later, this has not happened. One day is too long, and 10 years is an outrage. We can't give up hope and assume that the missing are lost forever. In the aftermath of mass atrocities, it is customary to seek justice and accountability. A formal tribunal where all related cases can be processed would make sense. ISIS members came from all over the world, and it's easier to handle these hundreds of thousands of cases in a systematic way rather than conducting individual trials scattered across different countries and jurisdictions. Where are our Nuremberg trials for those thousands who were killed and enslaved by ISIS? Justice is a moral imperative, but it's also a prerequisite for any genuine truth and reconciliation process in and around Sinjar. The international community wants to see reconciliation processes move forward, but let me be clear that any and all such reconciliation efforts will fail miserably if they are designed to replace justice and accountability. So justice must prevail for our people, above and before anything, before our community can ever engage in any reconciliation. A few months ago, Prime Minister Soudani was speaking here at the Atlantic Council. I do believe that he does care about the Yazidis, and it is very hard to change the direction of a large government bureaucracy like Iraq's. But there are steps he and his current administration can take that will help all of Iraq and can transform the areas where Yazidis and other affected communities live. Those in Baghdad and Erbil who claim to care about our community must take action to match their words. We must see tangible decisions. Specifically, Iraq must allocate some of its vast resources to most in need, and particularly Yazidis. It is really action that matters. Iraq's annual budget is currently $153 billion, and I repeat, $153 billion. But yet, hundreds of thousands of Yazidis remain displaced. They leave Iraq. Many of our people are living in tents and do not see a hope to continue living in Iraq. And how can that be with such a big budget like Iraq has? Mosul and other affected areas have been rebuilt, but our hometown, Sinjar, is still in rubble. Why are our people neglected? Why are the Yazidis neglected? And the question remains, is this the new Iraq? I paint a bleak picture, but we must be honest, and this is the accurate picture of the daily lives of our people, 10 years after the genocide. But there are also some bright spots. There is room to make improvements if there is courage and commitment from stakeholders in Iraq and the international community. One of those examples is the Yazidi Survivors Law. This has been the single best piece of legislation from our perspective that's ever been passed in the parliament in Baghdad. It formally acknowledges the Yazidi genocide, and it includes pathways for survivor recovery and economic support. So we call upon Baghdad and Erbil to work with us to explore and then implement creative solutions to help tackle deep-rooted challenges and advance the Yazidi recovery. In the best scenario, this could prompt a reinvigorative Yazidi community in Iraq. And there are 3 examples for the next steps. Number 1 is Iraq's Ministry of Education should urgently create a mandatory set of courses for all primary and high school students to provide accurate information about the diverse ethnic and religious composition of Iraq's society. Ignorance and entrenched prejudice have provided extremists with a breeding ground of potential members and a head start in recruitment. Education can combat this, but in the larger sense, it is a national imperative for the government to educate the next generation and instill respect, appreciation, and goodwill for all Iraq citizens. Number 2, Iraq's parliament should allocate a special budget for the development and capital investment in areas inhabited by ethnic and religious minorities. This would demonstrate to Iraqis and to the world that ISIS failed. And in the place of radical extremism, the areas ISIS had dominated the places that ISIS had dominated, they can be transformed into economic engines powered by a diverse Iraqi population. This could begin with the allocation that we requested of 1% of $153 billion, the national budget, for a reconstruction of Sinjar and the Nineveh Plains. And this allocation should become a regular feature of Iraq's annual budget so that ethnic and religious minorities can depend on this every year. Number 3 is Yazidis and other minorities desperately need independent political representation in Baghdad and Erbil. Parliamentary quotas should be established and respected to ensure our political voice, and such quota seats must not be manipulated by larger political blocs, what we see now. The United States has a unique role to play here. As we think back to August 2014, it is impossible not to forget the heroic actions of the United States military in aiding the Yazidis in our hour of desperation. The United States acted decisively 10 years ago and has been a clear leader in providing support to Yazidi recovery since that time. And I want to thank Undersecretary Uzra Zeya and Ambassador Van Schaak and all the US government representatives who are here with us to commemorate the Yazidi genocide that began 10 years ago. And I would like to underscore again to our American friends that while Iraq is awash with riches from the sale of natural resources, Yazidis still live in tents and Sinjar is mostly rubble. National Iraqi investment in the areas where our communities live can be transformative. Our people are not seeking handouts or extravagant projects, just a fair share of Iraq's wealth so our families can live in safety and meet basic needs. Baghdad should take this seriously. And we ask our friends here in Washington, D.C. to make sure that Baghdad takes this seriously. I want to thank Atlantic Council for co-hosting this event with us. And I want to thank all of you in person for attending here and those who are online as well. There are many Yazidi leaders and activists sitting here with us, and I would like to ask them to come to the stage so that we can do a moment of silence. Murad, Nibras, Natia, Dakhil. Thank you, everyone, for standing with us 10 years later.
Thank you, Perry. It is now my honor to introduce Her Excellency Under Secretary Zia. Dr. Ezra Zia was Senate confirmed and sworn in as Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights on July 14, 2021. Madam Undersecretary, this is also happening to be the anniversary of the establishment of the Iraqi Republic. So it is a very special day for us. In this role, Dr. Zia leads global diplomatic efforts to strengthen democracy, advance universal human rights, support refugees and humanitarian relief, promote rule of law and counter narcotics, cooperation, fight corruption and intolerance, prevent armed conflict, and eliminate human trafficking. Each one of these tasks requires a whole team and a whole secretary, to be honest, to do this worldwide. So we commend you for this. On December 20, 2021, Secretary Blinken announced Dr. Zia's designation to serve concurrently as the U.S. Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues, for which she leads U.S. efforts to support human rights and meet the humanitarian needs of the Tibetan people and preserve their unique cultural, religious, and linguistic identity. Along CV, I'm not going to go through all, but it is also important to mention that Dr. Zia is a graduate of Georgetown University and the recipient of several State Department Superior Honor and Senior Performance Awards, the Presidential Rank Award, the French Légion d'Honneur, and Cross of Commander of the Order of the Lithuanian Grand Duke Gediminas. So we are honored to have you, Madam Undersecretary, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, friends and honored guests. It's a great honor for me to be with you on this solemn occasion, the remembrance of the 10th anniversary of ISIS's horrific genocide. But before I begin, let me express my deep appreciation to the Atlantic Council, in particular, Dr. Abbas Kadim, for organizing this important event. But I'd also like to recognize Pari Ibrahim and all the Yazidi leaders who've joined us here today. Thank you for being with us this morning, and thank you for your tireless efforts to care for survivors and deliver justice to those responsible for this tragedy. Just 3 months ago, I stood at the foot of the beautiful and historic temple in Lalish, beside Prince Hazim, at a deeply moving commemoration where we remembered the victims of ISIS. The women and girls forced into sexual slavery, the men, boys, and elderly executed in mass graves, the thousands killed, and the over 2,600 we heard who remain missing. We remembered how Yazidis fled their homes to escape the targeted campaign of killing, sexual violence, and enslavement. We recalled that it was ISIS, with a diabolical campaign of hatred and violence that tried to tear apart the very fabric of Iraq's society by pitting tribes and communities against one another. But while we remember the lives lost, we also honor the strength, resilience, and determination of the survivors. As we know, hundreds of thousands of Yazidis are still displaced. Others have permanently left Iraq. Yazidis around the world bear the scars of that genocidal massacre. Today, we remember their suffering. But the best way that we can honor those we lost is to care for survivors and deliver justice to those responsible for this tragedy. And most importantly, we must unite in common resolve to ensure this atrocity never happens again. To that end, I am here today to assure you that U.S. support to the Yazidi community is long-term and unwavering. I traveled from Baghdad to Erbil to Nineveh in May, engaging leaders of the government of Iraq and the Kurdish Regional Government, or KRG, to urge justice for the victims. I stressed the U.S. commitment to supporting both government and grassroots efforts to deliver justice to survivors and to help them heal. Just last week, Secretary Blinken conveyed that same message during a listening session with Padi and other Yazidi civil society leaders, many of whom are here with us today. But I want to tell you, alongside the United States, you have international support. Since 2016, when the U.S. government recognized as genocide the crimes committed against the Yazidi community, other countries have joined us in recognizing the genocide. Armenia, Belgium, Canada, the European Union, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. So a decade has passed since ISIS perpetrated this genocide. And a decade later, Iraq is seeking a new path, one that repairs divisions and leads to peace, stability, and prosperity, and sews the fabric of Iraqi society back together. And a decade later, Yazidis are leading the way, rebuilding and showing the region that religious and ethnic inclusion is possible. We strongly support these efforts, but we know that so much more work still needs to be done. This is why the United States has long encouraged the Iraqi federal government and KRG to make meaningful and overdue progress after taking the important step of signing the Sinjar Agreement in October 2020. We've urged both parties to continue this critical work and to more closely consult Sinjar stakeholders in implementing the security, administration, and reconstruction elements of this agreement. The people of Sinjar have suffered for too long at the hands of competing political interests from outside their community. Working hand in hand with the Sinjar communities is the only way for the government of Iraq and KRG to ensure that the district's leadership truly works on behalf of those who live there. It's equally essential for federal police and Iraqi security forces to lead the effort to bring security to Sinjar, including through support to the local police force as called for in the Sinjar Agreement. To this end, we hope recruiting and training of this local force will be finalized soon. Meanwhile, the activities of militia groups in Sinjar and the Nineveh Plain continue to negatively impact community stability, preventing the return of internally displaced persons and stifling local economic development. Progress in resolving security deficits on the ground in Sinjar is therefore a necessary and urgent step to strengthen Iraq's security, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. These vital efforts are all part of a broader mission supporting the recovery of Iraq's diverse and pluralistic society in the wake of ISIS's campaign of destruction. Indeed, as I saw, the Yazidi homeland is a sacred place in the hearts of Yazidis wherever they reside. However, persistent security and reconstruction challenges in the area, as we heard earlier, ensure that hundreds of thousands remain displaced. The United States is committed to enabling all survivors and all displaced persons to enjoy safe, dignified, voluntary, and sustainable returns to their homeland. But make no mistake, such conditions do not yet exist. So what are we doing about it? To date, the United States has provided more than $500 million to support Yazidi and other ISIS survivors and advance religious and ethnic pluralism in Iraq to help heal and restore these communities. The Voluntary Return Grants Program we support through the International Organization for Migration has enabled thousands of Yazidis to successfully return and reintegrate into their home communities. Now, while we continue to press for improving the conditions necessary for return, we also support the needs of those who cannot yet return home. This fiscal year alone, the United States is providing over $114 million in humanitarian assistance for hundreds of thousands of displaced and vulnerable Iraqis. We are proud to be Iraq's leading humanitarian donor. Now, in looking toward more durable solutions, we welcomed Prime Minister Soudani's announcement in March of significant investments in new infrastructure and development projects in Sinjar, including 2 new hospital projects, 47 schools, and the establishment of Sinjar University. We also hope to see continued and expedited action from the federal government to fund efforts to rebuild the community. That is equally essential for ensuring the safe return of displaced Yazidis we all seek. So I shared this message personally with Prime Minister Soudani during my Baghdad visit. The United States also continues to support and advocate for thousands of Sinjaris in formalizing land and home ownership through the Yazidi Land Decree. As of June, 1,500 property deeds were issued to Sinjar families, finally recognizing property rights that had been denied over 47 years. So we welcome this progress. The impact of improving local governance, community security, and reintegrating the population cannot be overstated. But the full renewal of Iraq's diverse communities can only be achieved through justice and accountability. We will continue to work with the government of Iraq and the United Nations to ensure that UNITAD can wind down its operations in an orderly manner, that the evidence it's collected and processed is properly and sensitively preserved for future use, and that interested parties can continue investigations well after its September departure. We've also urged greater collaboration between the Iraqi government and UNITAD to continue witness protection, because this is absolutely essential for witnesses and victims who bravely provided their testimony and evidence. So just as the global coalition to defeat ISIS worked with Iraqi security forces to break ISIS's violent grip on Iraq, we will continue to seek justice for ISIS's barbarity and crimes against humanity in partnership with Iraq and our partners around the world. In addition to justice for the victims, it's time to demonstrate concrete progress in addressing survivors' concerns. We recognize the importance of the Yazidi Survivors Law, passed by Iraq's Council of Representatives in 2021, as an important step to addressing the needs of the multi-faith survivors. And while hundreds of survivors are receiving care and recompense, more are still waiting and are in dire need of support. So we will continue to support the crucial work of the government's Survivors Affairs Directorate to fully implement this law, including the provision of health and psychosocial services to ensure that survivors can live full, productive lives in peace. 10 years after ISIS's unconscionable genocide, the path forward is clear. Doubling down on local governance and security, support to reconstruction and reintegration efforts, and the delivery of justice and accountability are all essential to build resilience among the Yazidi community and ensure that ISIS and its successors never again threaten Iraq. It is incumbent upon us all to honor those we have lost, including courageous American, Iraqi, and coalition service members who gave their lives to defeat ISIS, and the brave survivors among us who, through action, partnership, and a steadfast commitment to the pledge to rebuild and restore. 10 years after the unthinkable occurred, I look forward to galvanizing our work together, supporting the survivors, and fostering a stronger peace and a democratic, inclusive, and sovereign Iraq. Thank you. And now I would like to hand the floor to Dr. Khadim and our distinguished panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Zaya, for this great perspective and vision that you outlined. It is a great guideline for many of us who are asked often, what does it mean to have robust U.S.-Iraqi relations? What does it mean to have partnership, alliance, and cooperation between the two governments? And what does it mean to put the 2008 strategic framework agreement that governs the relations between Iraq and the United States, the only such agreement that Iraq has with a major nation like the caliber of the United States represents in the world, both in the UN Security Council, in the United Nations, on the world stage. It means a lot for us to hear these words and these commitments, and also to know all of the details, or even at least part of the details of the good work that the U.S. government and the Iraqi government are doing together to help alleviate the aftermath of this genocide and many other cases in Iraq and many causes. And also, once again, I have to show all the respect that I have for your office and for the work that you have done, Madam Undersecretary, in the past 3 years. We are just over 3 years since you were sworn in. And as I said, with the tasks that are given to you, that each one of them really requires an entire team and an entire office to do this. And you do them so well and with so much good results that are around the world to help people that your office touches the lives of on a daily basis. Thank you very much again, and I look forward to having our first panel. Excuse me. Thank you very much, and it is my honor and pleasure to have the first panel for today. We have two panels that will be with us for the balance of the day, and we are so honored to have Aaron and Ismail representing two world's views, two parts of the way we look at this anniversary, but also they are integral views, and each one of them complements the other. I'm very grateful to see this presence from the State Department, the U.S. State Department, and especially the Iraq office that we are really honored to work with on a daily basis, almost, and if at least weekly basis, to talk about Iraq and to think about Iraq. And we thank you for all of the great work you do. And also, Murad, honored to have you and as the co-founder and the president of the Sinjar Academy. Your work is invaluable for serving the Yazidi community and for Iraq in general. So let me start, if I may, with you, Murad, and I want you to put us or to give us some context of the devastation that the Yazidi community received back 10 years ago, and what it means to a small community to have this level of atrocity and genocide committed against it, and also what kind of really the magnitude of that damage that has been done to the Yazidi community, to start us with.
Yeah, thank you, Abbas. Really, thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be here, and it's great, but also honor to just have a moment of silence for the victims of the Yazidi genocide. It's a heavy day for our community worldwide. To thousands of survivors who actually all scattered all around the world, from Australia to Canada to Germany to different places. Many people still wait for their family members to be rescued, to the 2,600. Many Yazidis still waiting for their family members to be identified from the mass graves, and that's more than 2,000 Yazidis were killed in the genocide. Most of family members still have not received the remains, and they have not buried their family members. Also, as was given in the remarks by Perry, which I echo every word she said, our community, the scale of the atrocities were, I think beyond anything that one would imagine. A small community, about 500,000 in Iraq, and the attack was really aimed as, killing and enslaving everyone who was on that mountain or around that mountain. I remember back in the day when attack was happening, and the estimate of how many people were under siege on Mount Sinjar, some estimates were, maybe 50,000, but our estimates were like probably more than 150,000 Yazidis were there on that mountain, and ISIS did not differentiate between, a child, a woman, a man, or anyone. Sometimes my daughter, I reflect back, sometimes my daughter asks for water, and she cannot wait for a moment or a minute. You have to provide her with the water. 150,000 Yazidis were on that mountain for days without water. And many people have shared their story with me that of their family members, who just died out of thirst, starvation. Remember other moments, for example, when Yazidis were trying to live through the safe passage, where ISIS had cannons targeting the individuals as they were fleeing. These individuals were, the people who were basically dying, trying to escape through the route. The devastation in terms of the killing and enslavement, about 10,000 people were killed and enslaved within a few days. The entire Yazidi community left the region. About 10,000 left on top of Mount Sinjar, who were under siege for about 3 months. The result of that genocide also, more than 100,000, 125,000 of the Yazidi community members have migrated outside Iraq, and that's like 25% of our population in Iraq. It's really, like, if you think about, the good thing that happened, I would say ISIS is no longer in place. We really appreciate the fact that ISIS is not in place. We appreciate all the blood of the Iraqis, the Syrians, and in fact, the Kurds, everyone who fought against ISIS, and the Yazidis who fought against ISIS on Mount Sinjar. We appreciate their sacrifices, because if ISIS was still in power, the devastation would be much, much, much more. We also appreciate the role of the United States and the coalition to defeat ISIS. But that work really is just still, it's just still a process. We still have at least, half of our population is still displaced. We still have in terms of the justice and accountability, more than, with all the ISIS members in detention, there's almost no real accountability that goes on. I would say, except of, let's say, few individuals who've been put on trial, like 10, less than 10, actually 9.
Okay. Well, again, it is one reflects on those days and on the history of the country. As a historian of Iraq, I'm still trying to wrap my head around how a moment like this really happened, given I mean, yes, Iraq did see a lot of atrocities in its history, but this one topped them all, and it's still really hard to wrap one's head around the magnitude of the atrocities that were meted on this community. State Department has done a lot. We just heard from the Undersecretary, Dr. Zaya, on all of the work that the U.S. is doing. As I mentioned in my introductory remarks, two things that we really need to focus on. One of them is to do what we can to restore life and to restore the community to, if not to its pre-August 2014 level, at least put this community on the path towards recovery. And again, we will talk later about the measures of ensuring that this never happen again, as I mentioned and as the Secretary just emphasized. Can you tell us where are we in the cooperation between the U.S. government and the Iraqi government on bringing the IDPs back, on restoring the areas in Sinjar and in other places? And this restoration means not just putting back together the homes and the roads and cleaning and the basic services and clearing the landmines, but also political restoration, as you well know, and you are working on, I'm sure, on a daily basis. The political competition and political disagreements over the future of Sinjar and the destiny of Sinjar. There is an agreement that has been put on hold, even though it was concluded. Can you update us on all of these efforts?
Of course, sure. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's good to see Undersecretary Zaya's remarks on this day, and I think we have our ambassador for global criminal justice here as well. So between the three of us, I think we'll touch on all of these issues that you mentioned. So it's an honor to be here from the Near Eastern Affairs Bureau. We appreciate the invitation. We want to thank Pari Ibrahim and Murad and all of the Yezidi leaders who are here and who are working on this issue. I really want to start with my compliments to all of them and to the activists who have been involved for all these years, because it's their advocacy, despite many obstacles over the years, that has literally saved lives and continued to improve the quality of life for some of Iraq's most vulnerable communities. So it is their work with us and with the Iraqi government that's facilitating the return of Yazidis to their ancestral homeland. So over these 10 years, we have accomplished quite a lot, I think, working together and listening to these communities. And our hope is, in recovering from this tragedy, that Iraq can serve as an example of religious and social ethnic inclusion for the region. Yazidis have led the way, frankly, working with Sunnis, Shia, Kurds, Turkmen, Shabak Christians, all of the Iraq's communities in this rebuilding process. There's obviously a lot that remains to be done, as you heard already this morning. Hundreds of thousands of Yazidis are still living in camps or displaced outside of camps. We know that 2,600 Yazidis are still missing, mostly women and children. So clearly we have much more work to do. For our part, for the United States government, we've contributed over $3.5 billion in humanitarian and development assistance towards Iraq's post-ISIS stabilization, reconstruction. As Undersecretary Zaya mentioned, $500 million of that is in direct support to the communities that were most affected by ISIS. And we continue to urge the government of Iraq to really take on this reconstruction effort. We need this partnership. And we're urging our international partners to support the continued reconstruction and funding. I think on the Sinjar agreement we've already been raised this morning, this agreement from October 2020, it's an important step, but quite a lot more needs to be done for implementation. We have encouraged the government of Iraq, the Kurdistan Regional Government, to consult closely with the Sinjar communities and the communities that were affected on implementation of the security and administration and reconstruction aspects of this agreement. We understand the challenges of this. This is a unique region. The Yazidis have suffered for many years at the political interests of outside forces in this region. I think that's well known. So we support an Iraq that is strong and stable and able to exercise its sovereignty in these areas. All of Iraq's diverse communities deserve this, to have a life of peace and enjoy a normal government that can support services and be responsive to all of the communities. So this is our goal for our partnership going forward.
Thank you, and it is highly needed, really. I must mention that we will be happy to take questions after we finish a few questions here and around questions from the panel, but we are very happy to take questions. You can use the online for the question and answer on that one, and I look forward to hopefully putting some of your questions to the panelists. Murad, let's go back to on the ground. The panel here talks about the geopolitics of the Yazidi situation, and put us in the picture on who are the key actors in the region and that have actions or wills or policies that might help or hinder the project of trying to restore the homeland of many Yazidi families that are in the internally displaced people camps, and mainly in Sinjar and many villages around wherever the Yazidis have been affected and were driven out, and we hear about a number of somewhere around 135,000 people who are still in these camps. So who are the actors, and what is the role of each one of them, the main actors, whether it's countries or groups inside or outside Iraq that are still playing a role or a number of roles to affect this effort and basically either, as I said, make it harder for accomplishing the goals that we are hoping to see with the Yazidi community returning back.
So, I think the complexities in Sinjar, but also in Nineveh Plains and all the way to Kirkuk, it has kind of twofold complications or developments that being first disputed between Baghdad and Erbil, which predated ISIS takeover, and the subsequent after referendum situation. So that complexity is still there, where these areas, whether it's Sinjar, Nineveh Plains, or Kirkuk, they really never got stabilized after the 2003 war because they had a very unstable constitutional situation, even though that was also the reason, if you look back why the genocide happened in the first place, why there was no adequate protection that was provided to Sinjar, why Sinjar was left without fight during the genocide. I think a lot of it is related to that these areas were never stabilized in the first place post 2003. Of course, that was further complicated by the withdrawal of the Peshmergas from Sinjar in 2014 and a situation which was developed, including the militias who came to outside, or the support that came from outside Iraq, from PKK, YPG, and others, helping to open the safe passage, for example. Then, I think also one problem with that, they try to, use their position being in Sinjar to now some of them trying to have permanent position in Sinjar that complicates the situation in Sinjar further, where, Turkey, as you know, Turkey have been conducting airstrikes for the past years.
Right.
There's potential of Turkey militarily coming to Sinjar. Turkey now is expanding its operations in the Kurdistan region, going after PKK. There's probably some sort of the deal between them, Baghdad and Erbil. We really don't know the extent of how much Turkey will go and whether Sinjar will be part of it. So I would say the PKK-Turkey angle on Sinjar is one of the really important ones. Of course, also, after the referendum or the withdrawal of the Kurdish forces from these areas, as you know, PMF strongly came to Sinjar as well as to the Nineveh Plains. And I think they're also capitalizing on their presence, both now, not just a military, but also politically. For the first time since 2003, the Yezidi quota seat in Nineveh, for example, which is our only political representation, PMF has taken that representation, just the way they did with the representation of the Christians over the years. So it's really the politicals and the geopolitics of Iran, Turkey influence on the region. And I think a lot of it is also tied up with the importance of Sinjar as geography, because it's in the triangle between Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And the communication between the Kurdish territories in Syria and in Iraq. And I think a lot of the interest in Sinjar is because of that angle as well. So the actors are, I would say, a lot of the Yazidi groups were also created post ISIS to help defend against ISIS. Iraqi government, which we've always asked the Iraqi government, we would like you to absorb every single person who carried the arms in 2014, bring them under Ministry of Defense and Interior, which is a step that Iraq never took. And I think that's one of the biggest issues we have in Sinjar, because Iraq always had, let's say, two positions, one a pro-state, one a pro-parallel state. Mm-hmm. I think that's really was the main issue. As situations develop after wars, as you know, militias get created, but then the role of the state comes that you want to bring everybody under rule of law. In Iraq, and that initiative was never put forward. I think an Ibn Sinjar agreement really lacked that. Sinjar agreement, let's say, called for 2,500 police, but these police were not from the former militias, they are new recruits. And the way even the police were recruited, so 1,500 have been brought to work, that was also very politically motivated. So I think, we've been asking, we also asking this in this paper, we don't want political attached security. Sinjar, we need to provide security that's provided by the state, from the Ministry of Defense and Interior, by the people of the region, without political attachment from any factor or actor, internal or external, which never happened.
Aaron, you direct the Iraq office, so that's a huge task when it comes to dealing with the complexity of not just Iraq, but the region, especially in the context of our conversation today. We heard about Turkey. There is also another dimension in Syria. And Syria is a place right now, especially where Sinjar is, there is this porous border that, the area itself, it's hard to tell even who is fully in control of it. There are many parties, some of them the United States can't talk to, some of them the United States considers, or they consider the U.S. as an enemy, and there is the Syrian government also, which is standing in a precarious position. There are also the two governments inside Iraq. One of them is the federal Iraqi government, and then Erbil, and each one has a stake. What kind of talks the United States is doing at the geopolitical level to make sure that we are moving ahead rather than having stalemates or gridlock on some of the key issues, that are standing, between the IDPs and coming back, between the restoration of the area? I'm sure it's not just financial or basic services, but the political question, which is really sometimes the hardest to crack or penetrate through.
Yeah,
as much as you can tell us.
Of course, thank you. And I will share as much as I can, of course. You heard Undersecretary Zaya mention that she was just recently in Sinjar. I spent some time in northern Iraq and northern Syria. many years ago, much closer to the beginning of this tragic period. After ISIS swept through northern Iraq and northern Syria in 2014, we mobilized the international coalition and a response that was both led by local actors and, of course, international. I was there as a State Department policy advisor, along with a task force of special operators from our Department of Defense. And I was able to travel through Iraq and Syria at that time, in the early days of our partnership. And that was across Iraq and Syria, and we had different and sometimes complicated partnerships as we were working to roll back ISIS. So during that period, I visited these cities that were very recently retaken from ISIS. And in each place, everywhere we went, the destruction was just unimaginable. It was if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, it would be impossible to consider this level of devastation. And each place we went, the local community immediately was ready to rebuild, was ready to partner with the United States, with the international community, with the federal government, with the Kurdistan regional government. And so those local actors were ready from day one. And we have been talking about these, the basic needs of reconstruction, rebuilding at both the local level and the international level with multiple partners across two countries, frankly, not just Iraq. And we're talking about basic needs, restoring water, schools, hospitals, electricity, bakeries. We spent a lot of time working on restoring bakeries. So we've been supporting these communities now for almost 10 years, and we will continue to do so. And it's both on the ground, militarily, and with development support through the partnerships that we have with quite a lot of NGOs that are involved here. And also, as you say, geopolitically with our discussions with some of these actors. Undersecretary mentioned that the goal is never again. And that is our, it is our national security priority to ensure the defeat of ISIS. And so we take that seriously. And we look at, the partnership now, 10 years on, is really with both the local communities and the governments. So we work very closely with the government of Iraq and the Kurdistan regional government, as you said, to ensure that these communities can rebuild and restore themselves with our support.
Are you getting any assurances that we are going to move forward, especially with the Sinjar agreement, or is it still, there are issues that you have to work through?
Well, the Sinjar agreement was a very promising start, of course. And as Hari said, the Yezidi survivors law the next year was also very useful. But of course, there is work to do, in both of these, in the implementation of both. And I will say privately that we discussed this with both the government of Iraq and the Kurdistan regional government on implementation and funding, frankly.
Okay, well, great. I mean, this is good to hear. Murad, we hear often a dispute that really is no longer just in the political corridors, but it is out in the open between the federal government, particularly the Ministry of Migrants and Displaced People, and also the Kurdistan regional government on the expediency and on also the rationale behind closing the camps in the Kurdistan region and bringing people back. There is the federal ministry seems to think that everything is ready and the people are able to come back or to go back to their areas, and the Kurdistan regional government says still conditions are not ripe for it. If we were to think about the Yazidi IDPs, what is your assessment as Yazidis, as organizations like yours, people who are watching closely the conditions and also the dreams of the people trying to lead a normal life again, put their kids back to school, see stability in life, and move on, build a life. We are, I was talking to my colleague, Nibras Basatki, we are lucky to have her, and she is also from the Yezidi community, and she says we have lost a generation, in between those camps and the life that was destroyed and the life we are trying to restore. Are we ready to see the IDPs back? Is the infrastructure, the political situation ready? Or do you think that one of the sides has more legitimacy in their argument than the other?
So I mean, sadly, this IDP's return was politicized, like everything else in Iraq. And this is one thing. You would think they would not politicize this, but it was. And just like the administration in Sinjar, for example, and other parts of the situation, also IDP's return was politicized. Of course, all the Yazidis would like to eventually go back home. We would like our people to go back home, because I always say, without taking the people back to Sinjar, and all the people, or at least 70%, 80% of the people, you cannot have a sustainable society that will, exist for hundreds of years or for long term. And currently, the people who've returned back to Sinjar, they're a small percentage, maybe 30%, 35%, 30% have returned to Sinjar. There are people not only inside the camps, but outside the camps too. So you're talking about 300,000 Yazidis who are outside, and also people of Sinjar who are non-Yazidis, who are outside, who have not been able to go back. At least 300 to 400,000, Sinjaris have not been able to go back, and that includes about 300,000 Yazidis who have not been able to go back. Some are in the camps, some are outside the camps. Of course, I think the Ministry of Displaced have, and I think given the political position of the minister herself, like she used her position, for example, to influence our quota seat, honestly. Like, she was distributing, aid to people, at the same time concurrently making political campaign for a certain candidate. So I think it's a real problem, the way that the ministry have been working. I think also we have some also issues with the KRG, for example, wanting to keep the IDPs in the Kurdistan region as long as possible. And sometimes it's also connected to the political situation, because I think they feel if people go back to Sinjar, they are going to be outside their influence, and hence more, politically probably more aligned with some of their competitors in the region. And it's also actually the competitors, not only just, let's say PMF/YBS/ sometimes PUK is a competition in Sinjar, because they would like to be the next ruler of Sinjar politically. So I think the whole situation from the both sides have been politicized. Now, we would like people to go back, but we don't like people to be forced out. I was in Sinjar. I remember in Sinjar, they said we had a camp on top of Mount Sinjar. They said we closed the camp. And I go to Sinjar, I see people in thousands still on that mountain. So, well, we just closed the camps on paper, but the people are still there. So I think the ministry's push trying to close the camps, it will just be on the paper. Of course, they are like threatening people. So they say we give you $2,400, which by the way, is not enough to even build a single room or a half room in Sinjar with $2,400. So that's part of the reason, as Perry said, we are asking for substantial funding for return. Iraq needs to commit at least $1.5 billion or $1 billion for return, where each family gets $10,000. I personally believe also there's a lot of corruption in the IDP's return. In one place, I heard that they are giving 5 million dinars to each family. They are buying one TV, one refrigerator, or some few other items, which cost like $700. So that money is also going to somebody's pocket in Iraq. And the problem in Iraq is really a lot of it is tied up to the connection, to the corruption, where people just pocket money from these IDPs, from these poor IDPs. We would like closure of the camps, basically, but we would like substantial support for return, including at least $10,000 to $15,000 per family. If Iraq is willing to do that, the Yazidi community will go back home. But you cannot go back to a place where you don't have a home. And the $2,400 they are giving, and by the way, they are threatening to reduce that amount to like $1,000, which is not enough just for transportation to go to Sinjar.
That's right. Yes. There needs to be serious consideration of the financial side of it. And this is, again, there are two kinds of, or two buckets of money, if you will. One of them is what you give to the families to be able to have a start as they leave, because now they have their needs met by whatever camp provision that is there. But once they go back, they need to be on their own. But also there needs to be another money that is allocated to the general community dwelling fuel or habitat, including, again, service restoration, including roads and other infrastructure that needs to be there. Some money needs to be invested in creating an economy for these families to work with. So it's not just that a check or a amount of money, you put it in the hand of someone, the head of the household, and say, go back to Sinjar, as you said, because these areas are still devastated. Aaron, there is this question. We are turning to some of the questions from our esteemed audience. As you well know, the UN, Iraq has requested from the UN Security Council to terminate the UNAMI, the United Nations mission, assistance mission in Iraq, and also to go back and take Iraq as a normal country that deals with the respective organizations that belong to the UN and other international organizations and on bilateral ways, and then take Iraq off this special status. The UN Security Council granted this to Iraq, unanimously voted to end that by the end of 2025. The question is here is how does the UN development mission in Iraq changes the Iraqi government's role in reconstruction and post-conflict efforts? So how is that? Will the Iraqi government and its role change under this new arrangement with the UN, or is it going to be same business but done through organizations?
That's a good question, and it's one that we're trying to address ourselves right now. The international community came together for a decade now to support Iraq's recovery in this situation, and the United States government, as you heard, is the largest humanitarian donor to Iraq, and we can find ways to coordinate our assistance from the United States and from international partners with the government of Iraq. I think we can do this through the current system of the United Nations. If we need to find another way to support this partnership that we have with the government, we can do that as well. So it's stay tuned. It's to be seen.
To be seen, and maybe I can also build on that aspect. There is also a change that is being planned for the transforming the U.S.-Iraqi security relation from a coalition relationship with Iraq to bilateral relation, and there have been a lot of work done by Joint Committee. Recently, there was the Iraqi Minister of Defense and a high-level officer corps that came here and spoke with their counterparts in the Department of Defense. I know this is a different part of the U.S. government, but again, I'm sure government agencies here in Washington talk to one another. So as much as you can share with us on how the change that will be envisioned through this bilateral relation in terms of what is relevant to our conversation, basically making sure that something like ISIS or another iteration of it does not happen. How is the new cooperation, the bilateral agreement on security between Iraq and the United States going to pan out on the theater to help us, maybe have some assurances that again, ISIS will not be a major threat, and also Iraq is able to build its capacity to provide security and peace of mind to its populations.
Well, these are all related, the security aspect of it, the economic component, development, all of it together. On the security piece of it, as you saw, the Minister of Defense was here recently in Washington. He met with his counterpart, Secretary Austin, at the Pentagon. This was part of an annual dialogue that the United States government has with the government of Iraq called the Joint Security Cooperation Dialogue. It's very much related to the bilateral security relationship and bilateral partnership that we have with Iraq. So those conversations are ongoing. It's the kind of thing that we do with many other countries. Separately, as you're aware, there's the Higher Military Commission. That process in Baghdad has been having conversations that I think are well known about the possible transition of the global coalition's military mission in Iraq. The global coalition to defeat ISIS will remain, of course, because much of its work is civilian focused. But the military mission in Iraq, we are certainly having conversations with the government of Iraq on how to transition that. I don't have any breaking news for you. It would be exciting on a Monday morning to share some grand announcement, but those conversations are taking place, and they're very responsibly, I should add, with the government of Iraq. We have a very serious partnership. We think it's going well, and it will be based on some predetermined factors, such as the possible threat from ISIS within Iraq, the threat in the region, the Iraqi military and security forces capabilities. So this is the conversation that's ongoing now, but it's very much a work in progress.
Thank you. We hope that all of this done as the window closes on the election, and then probably the rest of the year, we are getting to, as we get to October and maybe November, the attention will be on putting the house in order here in D.C., whether the same administration continues or another administration comes. So all of that, again, it will bear some impact on what goes on the other side, even though we are glad to have people who normally provide continuity and they work on this, people like yourself who are in the career side of this. Now, Murad, let me go back to another question from the audience. And there are so many aspects of the Yazidi genocide and what happened in 2014 and the years after the last 10 years. But one of the thorniest and probably the most heartbreaking issue is the missing Yazidi girls that, I met some of them who were liberated, and whether in Baghdad or here in the United States, and again, listened to the stories. And the question here is, basically, the questioner says it has been 10 years since they are missing, and the long duration of this captivity suggests that ISIS is alive, and the children born as a result of this kidnapping and the slavery that has been meted on them. What is being done by the international community, as you can tell, to find them, to bring them back, and also to deal with the time after their return? And the last part is probably from me, but I think it is fitting to add to the question. This is one of the most sensitive but also most heartbreaking aspects of that genocide. It's the people who were assassinated without being put to death, and that's how I would put it, basically. Yeah. And that is, something that really is on our minds and makes our hearts heavy as we still are searching after 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly it's easier to be killed than to be enslaved for that long, and the way ISIS treated Yazidi women and children is just the systematic nature of it, and the brutality of it, and the scale of it. ISIS took nearly 7,000 Yazidis, women, children, mostly women and children, but some men as well, as slaves. And from that number, thankfully, we've been able to rescue about 4,500 of them, 4,400 of them, which is a significant number. About two-thirds of these people have been rescued, of course, through different means. And we are very grateful to their courage that a lot of them, or most of them, have been able to recover and to restart new life. I see personally a lot of success stories by the survivors who also became spokesperson of the Yazidi community around the world. And I think the example that set forth by the Yazidi survivors is just a human example of courage, resilience that must be seen and recognized. Now, of course, for those who are still in captivity, the situation is very complicated for many reasons. Or the length of the time that these people in captivity. For those, let's say, who were taken as children, young children, they forgot who they are. They don't know who they are. Even they may just have glimpse on their history, who they are. But there will be hundreds of children who do not know they are Yazidis or they were Yazidis. They've been embedded into ISIS families or families of ISIS members, including some could be in Hall camp, which we've seen. People in Hall camp. It's really hard to identify them. There's some group of women who've had children out of rape. The complexity of the return is even much more severe, let's say, for a normal return. That also makes it complicated. The fact that they are distributed over a vast geographic area, under the areas of currently the Islamists in the northeast Syria. Some are in Turkey, some are in Iraq, some are in the Hall camp. Some are even in the detention center by the SDF's prison, which there's like 10,000 ISIS militants. And by the way, about 1,000 of them got amnesty and they left the prison. So that's another thing I think I really want to talk about here. The amnesty for ISIS members. So the people who enslaved these individuals, the people who committed all these crimes, some of them now are just getting out of the prison through amnesty, through political decisions, both in Syria and in Iraq. There is now a tabled law to pardon ISIS members without any accountability process. Yeah, so I think the process is very complicated. One thing is really was needed years ago was an international effort to rescue these people. There was an office by the KRG that did a really great job, and we really appreciate the work that was done in that space. But there was no international or Iraqi effort to bring all the intelligence together, talk to the family members, collect information about who these people are, and still there's need for it. I mean, I hope somebody will step in, will create this, whatever you call it, investigation team or investigative team that will gather information from the survivors, because some of them, I speak to some of them, they are in touch with the relatives who are in captivity, but that requires more sophisticated intelligence and hard work, let's say, to get them out. So it's possible to get hundreds of these people out if there was an effort in place, but sadly there's not. I mean, it seems not a priority. So.
And this is important. I'm glad that you brought up this. One understands that sometimes countries have policies that include giving pardons to people and taking care of certain legal and judicial aspects. But when it comes to having stakeholders and victims of those people who are imprisoned. These people who are not imprisoned for picking an apple from the apple cart. Some of them have done some of the most heinous crimes, and for whatever reason, to get them out, there needs to be a consideration, and the government and people involved, whether it's a law from the parliament or other means of pardoning or getting people out of jail, they need to sell it to the main stakeholders, especially the victims, and explain to them why this is done, and have their voice also and input on it, which is important. I will be giving everybody a minute or two, or as much as they reasonably can take, to leave us with final thoughts. But before that, I have a couple of questions here from the audience. One of them is, to Aaron. You have the benefit of working with communities around the world and see their cases and causes in a comparative way. You get to see more than one case. And this question probably is more fitting to be asked to you. It says, what can, or given the more powerful actors that deny the Yazidis their voice, given the current realities of Iraq and Sinjar, are there practical steps that could be taken to help the Yazidis represent themselves better? In other words, what can they learn from people that you deal with, from other countries, from other people, or here, or your own vision and experience? What do they need to do to represent themselves better and give themselves and their community better voice. People like Murad, people like Barry, people like others, or even those of us who are not Yazidis or not Christians and Iraqi Syrians, but we do get involved in trying to give voice to these communities, because at the end of the day, we all share one humanity and so many, and they are at the end of the day our fellow citizens. So one does not have to be Yazidi to do that, but definitely the people who are from the community, how can they represent? What are there any methods? Are there any ways, experiences that you know of from other communities they can benefit from?
It's a great question of what the current group of leaders and activists can learn from us. I would actually say that we can learn from them, because this has been a tremendous example of community leadership in recovery. Obviously, the results that we're seeing from the international community, we have a lot of work to do. The government of Iraq has a lot of work to do. And the United States government is continuing to support that. But this community has really been a tremendous example of activism, of success in terms of raising awareness. It is events like these that the Atlantic Council hosts, that the community leaders are participating in. It would be hard for us to give advice to how you could do much better to raise awareness. The Secretary Blinken, at the top of our agency, is engaged on this issue. So clearly something is going right when you have all of these senior officials in the United States government who are continuing to engage 10 years later. So we would applaud the efforts of the Yazidi community and leaders in what they're doing, and frankly, just continue to support them.
This has been a great start this dialogue and talk, and I'm very glad to really have voices that represent, again, this preoccupation from official and civil side or civilian side to try to help a community that needs every effort that they can muster to return back. Maybe it would be fitting to, again, leave you, as I said, or leave the audience with final words, something that you would like to say to us, to the people who are watching online or who will be watching this, to our audience, to the Yazidi community. And I will start with you, Murad, if there are any final thoughts, final words that you would like to leave us with.
Yeah, I think the first thing is appreciation to everybody who's helping. A person, a country, an NGO, any person who've worked. We would not be where we are without this help. It's really important to recognize all the great work that's been done. I think, to address the challenges, I would say administration, security, and economic prosperity, and IDPs return, dignified IDPs return, some of the top things that I would support. On the governance, I think Sinjar eventually would need to be a province. So the Ninawa Plains, I think the current structure of Ninawa will not help the minorities over the long term. And it's important to realize the fact that minorities are in decline in Iraq. The Christians from 1.5 million to 200,000, the Yazidis have reduced their number by 25% at least, and some other minorities like Sabias, Kakais, like Shabaks, like Turkmens are in decline as well in both numbers and political power. It's really important to realize that, and it goes back to whether Iraq wants to be a real multicultural, multi-ethnical country where everybody prospers or not. I think a lot of the Yazidis tell us, we want to leave Iraq. I mean, about 80% of the Yazidi population, and we have to put these facts, before the world, because that's what our people tell us, take us out, provide us with international protection, or take us out. So the substitute to that Iraq needs to take a very strong stand, a much stronger than what it has right now, and it has to see the minorities as a strategic factor in the country. On the security, you cannot run a country with militias running around with weapons, and then they translate that into political power, where they steal all the seats from the representation. You cannot have a country where a militia is running the country as a de facto. For Iraq to go to post-ISIS stage, and that's not just for the Yazidis, across Iraq, you cannot have political parties selling oil. You cannot have political parties making a decision, to send 100,000 militias somewhere to do something. And it's really difficult. The space for Iraqi youth, for the Iraqi civil society, for the Iraqi people, is closing. And it's really sad to see Iraq after a journey, a democratic journey. Now we are turning back to this very weird situation where political parties / militias / foreign countries control our security, and with a lot of malign actors, I would say. It's really important to address the security where the security is depoliticized. In Sinjar, we are asking the Iraqi government once again here, we would like you to create a federal structure from the Ministry of Defense and Interior, and you bring all those attached to any political, geopolitical idea, whether inside Iraq or outside Iraq, with any political party, make them police, federal police, make them people in the Iraqi army, and then you control that. And on the economy, we've said that a couple of times, for you to take people back, you cannot take people back with $1,000. You need to make serious commitment, and that will show that you really care about diversity and religious diversity. If you say I care, but you do nothing about it, and you leave the Yazidis in the hand of a bunch of militiamen who have created a parallel economy. They make millions of dollars from this economy, and now not only the military power, now they are also taking the political representation. So you're really just setting yourself for failure as a country. It's really important. I think the stake for Iraq as a country is really important, and especially for minorities, it's existential. This is not just, let's say, a small thing. I think the question is, will minorities exist in Iraq or not? Or this is just the last page? It's unbelievable. There will be no minorities in Syria after this whole episode. So the question is, will there be minorities in Iraq after this or not? I think that's the main question. I will just leave it at that.
A very important question. Aaron, you have the last word on leaving us with whatever you would like to leave us with.
Sure. I first of all, I agree entirely with Murad that, specifically on the administration of the region. The successive prime ministers have ordered the withdrawal of these armed militias from this region. It has to be controlled by regular Iraqi security forces, by local police under the Sinjar agreement. So we will never get past the insecurity of the community unless the community is involved in its own security and the government of Iraq takes control from these armed militias. So that's one specific point that's still very important. But just overall, this event, thank you again for inviting us from the State Department. This anniversary, August 3rd, is a solemn occasion, but it's also a moment for us to renew our commitment to the community and to supporting the recovery of the communities that have suffered from ISIS. As I said earlier, Iraq has a chance to be a model for the region of social and ethnic inclusion. And as Murad said, the political leaders of Iraq have to choose this. And as an international community, we can support them.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron. Thank you, Murad. And I thank our audience for listening to this panel. Thank you for the questions that came as well online. We are right on the time to conclude this panel. And I'm very grateful to both of you for your insights and for what you have given us to think about and reflect on. We will have also a panel. Right now, there will be a little coffee break, and then we will have a panel session on justice and humanitarian consideration that my colleague and friend Aqila will be moderating ably. And stay tuned to that. Once again, thank you all.
Thank you so much.
everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Akila Radhakrishnan, an international human rights lawyer, and I currently serve as the Strategic Legal Advisor for Gender Justice with the Atlantic Council Strategic Litigation Project. I'm just going to briefly introduce our panel, and then we're going to dive right into the second part of this discussion, really looking into the concerns around justice and accountability, as well as humanitarian issues. So to my left, we'll start with Ambassador Beth Van Skak. Ambassador Van Skak currently serves as the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice. In this role, she advises the U.S. Secretary of State and other department leadership on issues related to atrocity crimes, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Ambassador Van Skak previously served as the deputy to the GCJ Ambassador at Large and was a professor at Stanford Law School. Next, we have Pari Ibrahim. Pari is the founder and executive director of the Free Yezidi Foundation. Originally from Iraq, Pari fled the country with her family during the Saddam Hussein regime, and Pari founded FYF in the aftermath of the Yezidi genocide to support Yezidi survivors with a focus on women's rights, justice for sexual and gender-based violence, and the rights of ethno-religious minorities. And finally, we have Natia Navrazrov. Natia is the executive director of Yazda, a Yezidi-focused global NGO that was established 3 weeks after the start of the genocide. Natia is a French-qualified lawyer and previously served as Yazda's first legal advocacy director and helped to establish the Yezidi Survivors Network to support female advocates to support the passage of the Yezidi Survivors Law. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. So, we'll get started. So, FYF, Yazda, and the Sinjar Academy recently published a report on the 10-year anniversary of the genocide. And the report states that the Yezidi community is traumatized and impoverished, largely remains displaced, and continues to struggle to chart a future in Iraq. And the report importantly provides a series of recommendations on justice and accountability, as well as humanitarian considerations, which will be the focus of our discussion today. So Pari, let's start with you. FYF has long pursued a range of efforts to ensure justice and accountability, including criminal and corporate accountability, as well as work to ensure reparations for crimes against the Yazidis through efforts such as the Yezidi Survivors Law. Can you please tell us more about these efforts and why this is such a priority for FYF?
Thank you very much. Well, first and foremost, it's very important to ensure that a surviving community has a chance for justice and accountability and reparations. In most cases, it's not always the case that there will be justice and accountability, but we do strive towards that. In the situation for the Yezidi community, we've managed to work with IIIM and UNITED, the investigative bodies from the UN, one for Iraq and one for Syria, and make sure that we do the crime scene analyses. We make perpetrator dossiers, and we share that with them, but also we share that with public prosecutors around the world. So they are aware who the perpetrators were, that they are aware what crimes were committed. Because one of the things that is very important is that we ensure that we don't forget what the crimes were that were committed, so that we don't, everything we see is charges for terrorism. Mm-hmm. It's really unfair for the community because, yes, ISIS was a terrorist organization, but they were also a genocidal organization. They committed genocide, mass murder, rapes against the Yazidi community. So it is very important that we don't forget that. And by making sure that public prosecutors around the world are aware of the crimes that were committed, so that they can then add those charges to any cases that are ongoing. We've had a handful of cases, mostly in Germany, but there's so much more to do. I also want to point out that we shouldn't only look at like foot soldiers that were in Iraq and Syria. We have to really also look at those that invested financially in the ideology of the Islamic State. So there's a couple of them. There are also companies, and we, as an organization, we're looking deeper into that because it is important that if there is ever an ISIS 2.0, we prevent that there is financial support for those kind of organizations and those ideologies. So I think that if there is no justice and accountability, people in Iraq and Syria will think that it is okay to commit heinous crimes against the Yazidi community because you get away with it anyway. There's impunity, and we need to prevent that.
No, thank you so much, Pari. And I think that so much of the efforts have been led by the Yazidi community from the start, really the formation of the civil society shortly after the genocide, and really all of not only the advocacy, but the documentation, the pursuit of these cases has been a part of the community. And Natia, like FYF, Yazda has also been supporting accountability efforts, including cases in Germany under universal jurisdiction, as Pari mentioned, and engagement with UNITAD, the United Nations Security Council mandated investigative body that was set up to document ISIL crimes in Iraq, and which will shortly and perhaps prematurely be wrapping up its work. Can you please discuss Yazda's support to these cases in UNITAD, including the implications of the closure of UNITAD for the cases?
Thank you very much. I would like to start by thanking the Atlantic Council and FYF for organizing this very important commemoration. I also would like to acknowledge the suffering of the Yazidi community. I'm sure many are watching us, of course, here in the room, but also online. And I think this commemoration here in DC really sends this strong message that, despite the ongoing challenges, the community is not forgotten. I have been involved in this work for 6 years now, and every time we have a commemorative event such as this one, there's a panel on justice and accountability, and I'm very, very happy about that because justice remains one of the top demands of the Yazidi community. And you heard in the previous panel, but also in the remarks this morning, that Yazidis have been historically persecuted. It's not just ISIS, it's actually generations and generations of attacks and suffering. So that's why, the community, especially survivors now, have this strong, strong demand of justice, and it needs to happen at some point. So to your question, when a group like ISIS happens, and as Pari said, when they commit a genocide like they committed, and when members come from around 80 countries, you expect the international community to react in a more stronger way. And from the very beginning, we asked the international community to establish a court, an international court, the same way it was done in other contexts. The only response we got was the creation of UNITAD, which of course is a very positive step. UNITAD allowed to document a lot of the evidence that is in Iraq. But UNITAD is now being closed down, as you said, in a very, very premature way. And despite the fact that UNITAD is based on the advocacy of survivors, we were informed of the closure of UNITAD only a few days before it happened. And we had to activate a very quick advocacy. We put out a statement, endorsed by 50 NGOs, including FYF, Sinjar Academy, Yazda, and many others, and also NGOs representing different communities. So it really showed that the response was inclusive and that everyone wanted UNITAD to continue. In terms of the consequences that we see, of course, we will need to see after September as well. But as Pari said, right now, a lot of countries are prosecuting ISIS members only for terrorism. And often the reason given is that we just don't have the evidence. So right now, closing down a mechanism that actually collected evidence and not giving us any clarity on how this evidence will remain accessible is also feeding into this argument, like we can only have terrorism trials. The second consequence that survivors keep raising, and I consulted a lot of them after UNITAD's closure was announced, is the exhumation process. UNITAD actually supported, the Iraqi forensic teams a lot in that process. And the process started in March 2019 in Kojo and has been ongoing. And a few days ago, UNITAD finished to excavate the last mass grave in Sinjar that they can do in the time frame that they have. But we still have at least 33 mass graves in Sinjar alone that need to be exhumed. And on top of that, there are hundreds and hundreds of remains that still need to be identified. So the closure of UNITAD will have a consequence on that, and we need to ensure that the Iraqi forensic team continues to receive the support that they need. Another third consequence is the breaking the trust even more with the survivors. By taking that premature decision, of course, UNITAD was always meant to be temporary. The idea was to have UNITAD collect evidence and then have a prosecutorial mechanism or third states and Iraq take the lead. But closing it in such a premature way without informing the survivors' communities and also without explaining what's the plan forward is just further breaking that trust. And to your question on the cases in Germany, so, as I said, we wanted a tribunal, we didn't get it, we got UNITAD. And then in Iraq, we remained active on the advocacy level because we want justice ultimately to happen in Iraq. But what we have seen in Iraq are only trials for terrorism, where the focus is on the protection of the state, not on the active participation of survivors. So, these trials are not things we endorse. There are, of course, many other issues around these trials. So we started to look at other countries that were willing to bring ISIS members to justice. And as Parry said, Germany really took the lead for different reasons. Of course, ISIS members came from Germany. Actually, a substantive number of European ISIS members came from Germany. Germany also took in over 1,000 survivors who ended up on German soil and could be interviewed for a structural investigation. And then also Germany has all this history of international criminal law with Nuremberg and what happened also after. So as a small Yezidi NGO that started to document these crimes from 2015, we looked at Germany as the only hope. And so far, Germany successfully convicted 8 ISIS members, 7 women, 1 man. So these trials are also very gendered because of European politics right now, only women who accept and children are taken back. But as Parry said, we want everyone to be prosecuted, everyone who was involved, and men also played a big role along women. And the way we supported these trials is, of course, identifying survivors. Sometimes the German prosecutors just didn't know where the survivors are, so we were able to locate them in Iraq. And then we helped them to get proper interpretation. There were some issues. Sometimes dialects were chosen that were not from appropriate for people from Shingal. Survivors needed mental health support in these trials, so we provided that. We also identified legal representation for them. And then when these trials happen thousands of kilometers from home, we made sure that the information somehow comes back to Iraq, because what we also hear from survivors in Iraq is, why would I give you my testimony? No justice is happening. So it's important to show them that actually justice is happening. And maybe one last point, I think was a very important way in which we were involved in these trials. You have to imagine, I will never forget the first trial, Jennifer W., a German national accused. And then, I was in the courtroom with some other colleagues, including from Shingal. And you have to imagine the survivor from a village as broken and also, simple as Kojo coming into that courtroom and facing a German judge and a whole panel of judges, not understanding the language, them not understanding her, not knowing anything about German culture, them not knowing much about Yezidi culture. And then you have this dialogue. And what we did is that we created a guide that any German judge, investigator can just read before interacting with Yezidi, so that they get a crash course almost on what they should know to build trust and just ensure that the process is survivor-centered.
The work, I think, that groups like Yazda have been doing is just absolutely extraordinary, from not just supporting the legal process directly with documentation, but really thinking about how to make sure that where justice is happening, even if it's limited, it's being translated back to the survivors. And I think on this, we'll turn to Ambassador Ransgak, because you head up an office that really helps to build the global infrastructure of accountability. And we've heard this morning kind of in the different ways that the U.S. government has been committed and has been supporting the Yezidi community, including efforts through justice and accountability. So can you tell us a little bit more about how the U.S. government and your office has been supporting justice more broadly for the Yazidis, and how this dovetails more broadly with the work and the mandate of your office?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. It's really great to be here on this panel, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting and for everyone for tuning in. It's really a critical conversation. It's a solemn and important occasion to, as mentioned earlier, not only to acknowledge what happened in the past, but also recommit ourselves to the justice imperative, which is the big piece of my mandate, although we're obviously very supportive of all the humanitarian work as well. So our focus has been multifold when it comes to promoting justice for the situation in Sinjar and the declared genocide against the Yezidi people and other components of Iraqi society. We've already heard mention of the 2 international investigative mechanisms, both of which are focused on ISIS crimes. UNITAD is closing, and so now we're very focused on how to conceptualize the legacy of the key functionalities that are not yet finished. We still have multiple requests from third-party states who are engaged in investigations of ISIS members, and so we need to find a way that UNITAD's really important holdings remain available for those investigators and prosecutors. So that includes thinking about what to do with them in terms of an enhanced archive, and one of the ideas will be to put that information within the UN Secretariat and to staff that appropriately with outreach officers, with liaisons for prosecutors and investigators, and with survivor liaisons in order to ensure that when prosecutors need information on a defendant, on an incident, on a particular area, or maybe have a survivor in their midst, they can access that information in a way that enables them to use it for a criminal process. The second main functionality is to ensure that all of the witness testimonies that were collected by UNITAD under very strict informed consent protocols are kept safe and are only shared in connection with the requests and preferences and expectations and, frankly, consent of the individuals giving that testimony. And so we need to have someone who can continue to update that informed consent and ensure that individuals are comfortable having their information shared, particularly if it's the government of Iraq that ends up being the main engine of future justice. And then the third piece that is important to continue in terms of functionality is this exhumation question, the fact that we still have multiple mass graves that have not been fully exhumed, multiple, more than 2,000 individuals still missing. Some of those are alive, we know, still in custody or in very uncertain circumstances in Turkey and elsewhere, but some may have been killed and they may be in those mass graves. And the families deserve a sense of closure, not only for their emotional health and well-being, but also because there are administrative issues that come around having someone be declared dead in terms of reparation and other legal rights. And so all of that needs to be resolved. And so those three functionalities are something we're focused very much on diplomatically. The Brits have the pen on the UN Security Council resolution, but we're working closely with them and others within the international community to conceptualize these legacy functions. To echo the importance of civil society organizations like the two represented here, there isn't an international tribunal. Civil society organizations have been critical parts of the engines of justice. Many of the cases that have proceeded in Germany and elsewhere, not only involving Yazidi victims, but all the ISIS perpetrator cases, the returning foreign fighter cases, other cases, none of those would have happened but for the contributions of civil society organizations. And it's a really fascinating new public-private partnership that we're seeing between non-governmental organizations working with national prosecutors and investigators. And there's a lot of credit that goes to the civil society organizations, but I also want to give some credit to our national prosecutorial authorities around the world, because it's not a normal relationship. It's not something that they had done necessarily in the past, and they've really shown a willingness and a creativity to open up. The next phase, though, is this question of cumulative charging, and it's absolutely true that most ISIL members, whether they be returning foreign fighters or individuals who hailed from the region originally and are found in Europe or elsewhere, have been charged under terrorism provisions. And so it's not capturing the full scope of their criminality, and it's not capturing the harm that has been experienced by Yazidis and other communities. And so we need to put in the work and do the kind of investigative work that's necessary and take some risks in charging beyond the material support for terrorism, which is very easy to prove and has been a very handy thing for prosecutors to reach for. So I've been traveling around Europe, meeting with some of the prosecutors and investigators who are doing this work in Germany and Sweden and elsewhere, and really trying to understand what the barriers are to them bringing broader charges, but also how civil society groups can contribute to that. So we, as a funder, as a donor, can be sure to ensure that these groups have the funds they need to continue to contribute to justice processes.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And just a note for those in our live audience as well as online, you can go to askac.org if you have a question. We won't be taking questions from the live audience directly, so if you do have one, go ahead and log in on your phone and you can ask your question there. So really, I mean, I think this conversation has highlighted the myriad reasons why justice and accountability is so important. And Pari, in your introduction, you mentioned that reconciliation is not possible. Though there are efforts being made at reconciliation without justice. So I think, to think about, with the shutdown of UNITAD, the work that remains to be done now to kind of wrap up and as you described, Ambassador Bonskak, really think about the legacy of that. But what are the benchmarks we want to see now going forward? There were nascent efforts to have a law implementing international crimes in Iraq. And so when we talk about the fact of, charges of only terrorism in Iraq, it's not possible to charge necessarily these international crimes. So what are the benchmarks and kind of things that we want to see to make sure that this conversation continues to move forward and perhaps that accountability is in third states but also brought back to Iraq?
I think maybe we can go to what the U.S. could do for the Yezidi community in Iraq. And one of the things is Yazda and the Free Yezidi Foundation are a civil party in the Lafarge case in France. Lafarge pled guilty here in the U.S. They got a fine for almost $1 billion. It is very important that these funds could go to the victims, the survivors who are in Iraq living in tents. A little portion of this money could help and support these communities to recover. So when we're talking about like people moving forward, if on one hand you never get justice, it's okay. For those where the perpetrator is already dead, we understand there will be no justice. But if there's no justice at all, it is unfair to ask people to reconcile with neighbors who might have committed horrendous crimes against them. But there's also another part of it where there is reparations. And so we know the Yazidi survivors law, but there's also reparations in other forms where like this almost $1 billion, if some of that money would go to the survivors, they could pick up the pieces and have some closure and move forward. I think that is necessary. And we've also talked with Ambassador Bet's office, Van Schaak's office, to ensure that is there a way where we can make that possible? Is there a way that we can advocate for our survivors so that they can get a portion of that and create a new life? It is not easy. It is true that Lafarge pled guilty in the US, and the case in France is still ongoing. In Europe, we will get a $50 symbolic apology, basically. In the US, it is totally different. So can we use that? Can we not? I think that is one of the questions that remains for our community at the forefront of this.
Yeah, I echo everything Pari just said, and I would say, maybe in terms of short-term benchmarks, as I said, and as the ambassador just said, I think it's very important that the UK and Security Council members, including, the P3, US, France, and hopefully also others, ensure that the evidence remains accessible, that it can be analyzed. Otherwise, we're talking about over 125 million that UNITAD spend with the contributions of the UN and states for nothing. I'm exaggerating, but I'm actually not. So it's very important that this work continues. Also short term, we need to extract the UN forensic team that is right now working within UNITAD with the Iraqi forensic team on the exhumations and allow them to stay in country in some sort of form or shape. I'm not sure how, but I think it's important because they have been building relationships with the affected communities, with the Iraqi counterparts for 6 years now, and we're going to waste that. And we need to link this issue of exhumations and missing people to the issue of truth, which is another component of justice, and also to the issue of reparations. As the ambassador said, families need to know what happened to their beloved ones, but they also need to have certificates that prove that someone in their family was killed, and then they can access some reparations in Iraq. Also, in terms of short term, we need to ensure that if Iraq wants to continue this process, it does it in a survivor-centered way, and that the whole post-UNITAD conversation happens with survivors and affected communities and civil society, such as ours, who have been active in that sphere for many, many years now. And there is a draft law currently that is being discussed, which would criminalize genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes in Iraq, because up to today, 10 years after these crimes, in Iraq, there's still no law that allows prosecution for genocide and other core international crimes. But we have been hearing that this process will move forward, and we want this process to move forward, but we want, again, consultations of survivors, and we want the law to have also survivor-centered provisions, not to be just a technical law with definitions, but really also having discussions around how to ensure that survivors come and actually testify in a court in Iraq. Because I'm pretty sure, when I speak to survivors in Iraq, if you pass the legislation tomorrow, none of them will show up because Iraq, operates in a very tribal way. So you need to ensure that they will be safe when participating in these trials. On a more medium-term way, as I said, we wanted a court. It's pretty much clear that we are not getting it. But we could still try to identify 2 to 3 very high-level ISIS members and prosecute them with the participation of Iraq and the international community to give, as Pari also said, the Yezidi community the Nuremberg moment. Because having these 9 trials now in Germany, then having one in the Netherlands, then in Sweden, and then next year in France, is not something that history will remember. We need at least 2 or 3 people, high level, to be prosecuted. And we have some of them in detention in Iraq right now, like al-Baghdadi's daughters and wives. They've been giving a television to talk about what happened. Why are they not put on proper trials? So I think that would be very, very important. And then more long term, I think what Iraq needs, and just echoing everything that was said today, is a transitional justice framework. We are always, when we think about justice, think about criminal justice and accountability in the court of law. But beyond that, there's missing people, there's mass graves, there's this endless cycle of violence within the Iraqi society that needs to be broken. And I do think that the Yezidi survivors law is the quasi-transitional justice legal framework on which we can build on, also including other communities, to ensure that we also address the deep-rooted causes of these genocides. And maybe just finishing on one example, last year, in the middle of the 9th commemoration of the genocide, Yazidis were targeted by a wave of hate speech. People saying things like, what happened to the Yazidi community was deserved, and what ISIS did, they did well. And this was not coming just from people who are, thinking within ISIS ideology. It was coming from, people who are part of the Iraqi society and who often deny those crimes because they say they did not happen, or say, Yazidis are exaggerating. So having, transitional justice, including a truth mechanism that uncovers what happened and also points to the failure of every single party that enabled that genocide, because, it did not happen in a vacuum. ISIS did not just appear out of nowhere, and we all know that. So yeah, I think more long-term we need to, and with the support of the US, look more into these things.
I think also just to add to what Natia said. So it is not that in Iraq there's no perpetrators. There's a lot of perpetrators, and we know of some. Like one of the cases, I think it was called, he was called Hamza al-Khatuni, Abu Hamza al-Khatuni. He was in jail in the Kurdish region. He died in jail. He was a mastermind of one of the massacres, I think, in Kocho. Why did this perpetrator not go to court, and why could we not see a court case against him where our survivors could point at him and say, he did this, this, and this, and we want justice? Nothing happened. Terrorism charges. He eventually died in jail. That is not justice. We could have had a case. And I think that is what is so frustrating when we talk about justice and accountability in Iraq. Yes, now UNITAD has all this evidence. It's going to be stored in New York, probably. A lot of the survivors, in our case, maybe also in your case, Natia, they've said to us, we do not want to share this with authorities in Iraq. So it already stops there. But as Natia said, if we had a chance where we could safely give people a chance towards justice in a court that is fair, then people would want something like that. But we don't have it.
There's no question there's a lot of unfinished business here. And in our bilateral relationships with and engagements with Iraq, we have encouraged them to enact this law that has been kicking around, I think, some of the parliamentary committees and such. It exists. It probably needs to be more consultative. But there is no legal framework right now to prosecute core international crimes within Iraq, which is why we have this very unbalanced situation where they can just only reach for these terrorism charges, which doesn't capture the full scope. So that is clearly something that needs to be done. Many ISIL members have already been prosecuted, as we've heard, but there are still, as we heard this morning, many, many in Al-Hol. And if those are to be repatriated, then it would be good to have a broader range of charges to be able to reach for. I couldn't agree more that the concept of justice needs to be broadly understood, to not just include criminal charges and putting individuals into jail. There has to be a reparative component, a truth-building and a truth-telling component. And the reparative component, much of it, I think, resides within the government of Iraq, and the Yezidi Survivors Law needs to be fully funded and implemented, but the international community bears responsibility as well. And so we're looking for ways to support and to be able to contribute to that exercise. And thank you for mentioning the Lafarge settlement. It was an incredible result, a company that essentially admitted to paying enormous amounts of money to ISIS to be able to continue their operations in northern Syria. It generated an enormous settlement. And so we're working with the Department of Justice to think creatively about how, and working with France that also contributed to that case, about how some of those funds might be made available in various ways to support the communities and the victims broadly defined of ISIS. And finally, to the point of reconciliation, reconciliation belongs to victims. It's their decision as to whether or not they can reconcile. And processes, mechanisms, the international community, governments can't force reconciliation on people. They can create spaces for reconciliation to happen, but reconciliation without a broader notion of justice is going to be impossible if individuals remain impoverished, living under tarps. If individuals don't see any sense of justice, they're suddenly being asked to forgive members of their community that supported ISIS or that were potentially ISIS members. That's unreasonable to ask anyone to do. So we need to think about justice as broadly defined and to find ways to invest in those processes as an international community.
Just to add to, I mean, justice and accountability is really what we love to do. So just about the ISIS detainees, so we're now hearing a lot of different things. We're hearing that perpetrators are being released from Syria in jail without any judicial process. This is very concerning because how can you say if someone committed certain crimes when you haven't talked to the Yazidis who actually took all that investigation on themselves, have all the documentation, or even UNITAD and IIIM. I have the feeling that these perpetrators are just being, let's just say, perpetrators are being released without any judicial process. It will have a big impact on reconciliation because I think when we talk about reconciliation, we need to think about the victims, the survivors, but it shouldn't be a tool for the perpetrators to get away with the crimes they committed. And I feel like we're being, as the Yazidi community, we are being pushed into that direction where forgive and forget and move on. But how can we move on when we haven't closed the chapter?
Do you want to add something?
Just to also quickly add, and I think it was already said multiple times, but I want to echo the fact that ISIS was not just external people coming in from Syria or foreign countries. Actually, most of the ISIS members who attacked Shingal were from the region, were neighbors, came from Ba'aj, came from different neighboring areas. So talking about reconciliation without having put these people on trial is very, very inconceivable. And then when we also talk about designing reconciliation mechanisms, I think we need to be very mindful of the fact that Iraq is a very tribal community, and often tribe leaders are men. So we need to make sure that when we design these mechanisms, we also include women and girls, and also specifically survivors. Otherwise, and I have seen that you end up having some tribal peacemaking processes where it's basically only men sitting in the room deciding on something and not reconciling because they genuinely believe in it, but reconciling because, I will not attack you, but give me access to that road. So it's very for practical reasons. And I want to highlight the role of women also because, I was working a lot on the Yezidi Survivors Law in the early days when it was still a draft, and it was meant to be only for Yazidi survivors in the beginning. And I saw myself how Yazidi women and girls stood up for survivors of other communities, Christian, Turkmen, and Shabaks, and said, no, I want them to be included because I have seen them with me in captivity, and I have witnessed the crimes that were committed against them. So I do think that women can really play a big role in this process of reconciliation, bringing communities together, peace building. But again, we cannot have this without having first, criminal accountability and some other measures in place.
Yeah, and maybe to dig in a little bit on this, on kind of the extraordinarily gendered nature of the harms that occurred during the Yazidi genocide, as well as the context of, I think, Iraq as a relatively patriarchal society, Natia, you mentioned that the universal jurisdiction cases have been gendered, where we've mostly seen women being prosecuted for the gendered harms, and we actually haven't seen those who perhaps, initiated the ideology that really defined the gendered contours of the genocide. So just very quickly, because I know we have other things we want to discuss, but what do you think needs to happen, not just on reconciliation, but what's the role of ensuring gender justice in the court cases and in accountability processes, and what do we specifically need to do to make sure those concerns are answered? I know all of you have expertise on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, first of all, I always hear how we say ISIS fighters. So I don't like this term. To me, it's ISIS members, because not all of them were fighters. Some of them were judges, some of them were having bureaucratic roles. They were not per se involved in fights, but they were enabling the whole, enslavement system. And then in that group, you have women and men. And of course, and Pari knows that as well, a lot of Yazidi survivors told us about the prominent role of women, ISIS women who actively participated in the enslavement, but also often prepared survivors for rapes, like putting clothes on them, putting makeup, like very unbelievable things. But the men were also, as you said, behind the ideology, and they were actively involved. And I think, and it's a very sensitive question. I'm from France, and whenever I speak about repatriation, I get a lot of backlash, because people tell me, no, we cannot bring them back. We cannot bring those men back, almost like trying to ignore that it happened. But I also think that Western countries need to engage in transitional justice in a way, because why did their nationals join a group like ISIS in Syria and in Iraq? Like, you cannot ignore the fact that they did it, and leaving them in Al-Hol or in Iraqi prisons is not a long-term solution. Western countries also need to do that historical exercise where they try to understand why what happened. But maybe, one last point on the gender aspect. It was interesting to see in the German cases how the gender crimes were not brought. It was killing and enslavement in general, but not the gendered aspect of it. So with some legal experts in Germany, actually, and the lawyers, the German lawyers who pushed forward that case, we had to bring this and really highlight that a lot of the crimes that were committed were gendered. And I think it was successful only in one case, in the Sarah O case. But moving forward, we need to ensure that this gender aspect is included.
Beth or Pari, do you want to add anything?
I would just say, I think in many respects, we've put our finger on the key element, which is inclusivity. Any policy responses, interventions, investigations, they have to include women to discuss their own experience so that we are not blinded by gender stereotypes in terms of who is ultimately responsible for establishing and maintaining and continuing the system of enslavement that ultimately led to the genocide, and the role that women have played. These were not young girls who were necessarily duped by some romantic visions of a marriage to an ISIS fighter. No, many individuals chose to join. They were key to upholding the ideology and key to upholding the system. And I've really been heartened to see some of the European prosecutors, many of whom are women, talking to women to try and really understand what was happening and the role that the particular defendant played. So in Sweden, for example, there's some amazing cases involving Swedish women who did join ISIS, traveled to the region, came back or were repatriated, whether voluntarily or otherwise, and they're being charged with child endangerment because they were grooming their own children to be cubs of the caliphate, to be married off to ISIS members. And so this is a show, I think, of real creativity on the part of prosecutors to look at the entire crime base and then look at the tools they have available to them and marshal those in the service of justice.
And let's not forget that they are actually involving the Yazidi community and calling us as expert witnesses to talk about this issue. And I think that's also important. Like, they are trying to be very creative in the law that they have at hand with which articles can they use to ensure that the perpetrator doesn't get away with the crimes they committed. And then at the same time, also bringing the perspective of the Yazidi community here so that the world can hear what happened when they joined ISIS. And it's a total difference with the US. Here we had the Samantha al-Hassani case, and Samantha al-Hassani and her husband did purchase Yazidis from the slave market. They were slaves in her house, and her husband raped this Yazidi girls. Unfortunately, as of now, Samantha al-Hassani is free and walking around as if nothing happened. I think she pled guilty for very minor terrorism charges, I think. But in the US, they were too afraid that the jury would not see this as her crimes that she committed against these Yazidi children. And that is something that we also need to keep in mind, right? We shouldn't always assume that the women didn't do anything, that they were just bystanders and that it was the decision of the men. As Natia said, and as we heard from a lot of the Yazidi survivors, that the women were most of the time making these women, girls, ready for being raped, makeup, clothing, and those kind of things, push them in the shower. And we should not forget that. We need to make sure that whether you are a man or a woman, whether you joined ISIS as a cook or you were a judge, that you are held accountable and that you don't get away with the crimes you committed. Also for Europe, we're going to see more and more cases. We're being contacted. We're getting through Europol. We're getting hits of perpetrators. So countries can get that information as well. And we are going to see more and more cases. Belgium, Sweden, hopefully in the UK as well. So fingers crossed.
Well, and I'll just point out that maybe it's a little extraordinary that two of the leaders of the major civil society organizations pursuing justice are women. That's not something that we often see in this world of accountability, and I do think that it's something that's also helped to make sure that the conversation around gender is really centered in all of these efforts and kind of in a very diverse and inclusive way, as you said, Ambassador. We have some questions from the audience. I know we also want to touch on humanitarian concerns, and I would be remiss if we didn't talk about some of those. So before I open to audience questions, so, you know, we've heard today about the range of humanitarian concerns that need to be addressed kind of as the wheels of justice are slowly turning. The impact of protracted displacement, looming IDP camp closures, 2,600 Yazidis remain missing, and the need for a pathway for the safe, voluntary, and dignified return of the Yazidis to their homes. So what does the international community need to be prioritizing now, and how do we ensure that addressing these concerns is done concurrently and not instead of, which is often the conversation, of long-term priorities such as justice?
Okay. I think in the justice and accountability perspective,
the humanitarian concern. So just kind of thinking about how, in parallel, we've been talking a lot about justice, but what else needs to happen to address kind of the immediate humanitarian concerns right now?
I think that I would just look at it from a woman's perspective, right? So we look at the community. The men were immediately killed. The women suffered the most because they were taken as slaves into the caliphate. So we need to also look at their concerns, right? We need to have them around the table to see what they want. And when we hear from Yazidi women, when they speak, they really talk about safety and security. Aside from safety and security, like being able to live in your home peacefully without being afraid. Aside from that, we also need to look at the infrastructure in Sinjar. Like, if you want to go home, you need to have a house. You need to feel safe. And I always say, like in a lot of, with a lot of Yazidis lived also in mud houses. My people are very basic people. They don't need a big villa or something like that. And then you think about Iraqi government having a budget of $153 billion, and you can't even take care of your citizens, the people who live there and have been treated so horribly over the last 10 years, not only by ISIS, but also by the government of Iraq, by the government of Kurdistan. I always want to say that the Yazidi Survivors Law was a really good step forward. It will give our community, and I know in the future maybe other communities that suffered at the hands of ISIS, also a way where they can pick up the pieces and start a new life. But if you look at like the 2009 law, Article 20, it says that if you've suffered from a terrorist attack or in war, your family has been murdered, etc., you can apply for reparations. Thousands and tens of thousands of Yazidis have applied for those reparations, and until today, Iraq has not given them any idea of where it stands. Are they going to get reparations or not? It's been now 10 years. So many Yazidis have applied for it, have submitted everything, nothing. And this is something that is so simple for the Iraqi government to do because, first of all, you created the law. You have the law. All you need to do is just go over the submissions and give the people what they deserve. And it's not happening.
Yes, and maybe also referring again to the Yazidi Survivors Law. So far, I mean, for the past 3 years, it has been implemented. It has focused a lot on the monthly salaries. Like survivors are receiving monthly salaries, and it changed a lot of lives. Like I think it's around between $500 or $600 per month, and this is a very consequential like amount for survivors living in Iraq. And I think the directorate and the ministry has done a good job. But the Yazidi Survivors Law is broader than that. It also has rehabilitation measures and linking it to the humanitarian concerns. It has a lot of provisions about mental health, access to medical care, and that still needs to start to be implemented. And I think, international community needs to support Iraq in the implementation of these aspects of the law. The law also speaks about employment, education. I want to highlight one of the ideas Murad has, with the Sinjar Academy, which is to open a university in Shingal. And I think it's a beautiful and such an important idea because, you mentioned Paris and myself. Like I grew up in France, Paris in the Netherlands. We had access to education and opportunities that many of our people don't have in Iraq and in Shingal. And we were talking about lost generation, and I do agree with that statement, but I also think that we need to look at how to ensure that we, in a way, save that generation and also the following generation. So a simple idea as having a university in Shingal, I think, needs to be implemented. And, Sinjar Academy is already doing a very good job offering education opportunities online, but we need a physical space. We need a space where Yazidis can go to and think about other things than just the genocide, where they can be creatives and really thrive. And as Parry also said, make business investments. And, it's very, very important. And maybe one other concern that I see and that I have been observing is how, and again, it's, I think, linked to the fact that Sinjar is such a disputed area still until now, how difficult it is for survivors who want to access the Yazidi Survivors Law or any other person from Sinjar who wants to access any administrative benefit, the struggle they go through, like just to redo a simple document. Like they need to go to 10 different offices, they need to go to Tel Afar, they need to go to Mosul. They don't want to go to Mosul, like they feel unsafe most of the time, and they're spending transportation money, they're wasting time, they're being told to go to this office and then this office, and ultimately a lot of people just get tired and give up. So I think just structuring Sinjar, it's linked to the whole administrative issue, should be a top priority, because again, you want people to go back, but you need to give them security, you need to give them an income, and you need to give them agency and access to whatever administrative things they need to do.
And I think it could not be more important to kind of think about what are the smaller details, right? It's great to have a law in place, but it means nothing if you can't access it, and if you don't have the ability to kind of go through all the administrative processes. So we have some questions online that we're going to turn to. This one isn't addressed to a particular person. I think all three of you are well qualified to answer it. So the idea for ensuring UNITAD archives sounds great. How likely is that to happen, and if so, when? Because from what I've read, it seems that the Iraqi government is asking that they be the ones to store the evidence. UNITAD is collected, or perhaps give permission for it to be stored to used in the future, do you trust the Iraqi government to do the right thing? And I guess why or why not?
Yeah, I'll
you wanna
get
start?
started on that. Yeah,
Yeah.
UNITAD will close its doors in September. So that's the time frame we're working on. So we need to come up with ideas to ensure some level of seamlessness in terms of the information sharing and the holdings. I think there is a two-part approach to this. One is all of UNITAD's holding, including those holdings they took from the witness testimonies and from survivors that maybe can't be given immediately back to the government of Iraq. And then a number of those documents that originally came from the government of Iraq and have been refined and analyzed by UNITAD in terms of understanding the order of battle and the chain of command and how the timeline of what happened, et cetera. All of that refined work that will support cases and jumpstart the work of national prosecutors. So we need a two-part strategy. We're working with the government of Iraq to help them think about how they can carry on this information sharing function. My sense is that they genuinely want to enable these cases to happen, even if they're happening in third states. They want to also do them themselves. That will require an investment in their national legal framework and also require the creation of a system of information sharing. And so I think there's a lot that the international community can do, working through civil society organizations that are based in Iraq in order to set up those systems to make that happen. We then need to conceptualize what to do with the larger set of holdings and to ensure that prosecutors in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere where they have ISIS members in their jurisdictional reach have the evidence necessary and available to go forward. And we know, as was mentioned, there are dozens and dozens, maybe more, cases in the pipeline. I've heard this from the prosecutors directly. And so they're going to continue to need this access to information, to witnesses. They're going to need the help of CSOs who can accompany witnesses through a difficult justice process. We need to think about witness protection issues because we know that ISIS, there is a resurgence of the organization. It's not as centralized as it was before, but they are still recruiting members. And so individuals who are in a position to testify need to be kept safe so that they can feel comfortable coming forward and accusing individuals against them. So between working with the Iraqi government to set up their own national system for third state sharing, working with United Nations to make that information available, this is all the work we're going to be doing in the fall.
Do either of you want to add anything?
I mean, we're really looking at the U.S. government to support our, the voices of the Yazidis and their concerns. We've had this conversation many times, echoing what Ambassador Van Schaak is saying is we need to make sure that the Yazidis feel like their trust in UNITAD is not washed away. Because that was the whole thing. A lot of the survivors went to UNITAD because they trusted the UN mechanism. We need to not underestimate that, right? Because some of them, they don't just go anywhere to just tell their story. They go to the United Nations, and that's the key thing to remember. And as I said previously, a lot of them do not want to share their the evidence with their testimony with the Iraqi prosecutors or anyone who's involved in the case. And I think that is because they don't feel safe. So safety and security, we've had this conversation also with Ambassador Van Schaak's office. Safety and security for the Yazidis is important. If they want to testify and point to a perpetrator, they better be alive when they come out of the court. If we can't guarantee that, then we can't look for justice in Iraq.
Yeah, maybe just very, very briefly, I think I just want to highlight that, despite these UJ cases abroad, I mean, we're very supportive of them and we will continue to support them as civil society organizations, even if, and hopefully not, the evidence is not, UNITAD's evidence doesn't become as accessible as it should be. But ultimately, our position is also that we want justice to happen in Iraq. We want this to happen there because this is the homeland of the Yazidis and the other minorities who were targeted. This is where most of the survivors are, where most of the evidence is, including crime scenes and including as well perpetrators. So we want it to happen there. But what is missing is the trust. And it's not being rebuilt by the Iraqi government. And creating UNITAD and then closing it without a proper public plan is not a way to rebuild that trust. And they might have a plan. I have been hearing some ideas that are floated, but they need to be also more transparent because right now the message we receive is we're closing UNITAD, we will take over, but where's the trust building part? It's lacking. So, I also know that, I put the politics aside. I know that the Iraqi judiciary, especially in Baghdad, is very keen to prosecute for these crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes. They have worked with UNITAD on digitalization. They have digitalized a lot of the evidence that they had gathered from battlefield evidence. And they are keen to use that for prosecution. And I think that's a good sign that the technical, at least Iraqi team is willing to do so. And same for the Mass Graves Directorate, medical legal team. They have been doing a great work on the exhumations with the limited resources that they have. So I think and as the ambassador was saying, like prosecutors all over the place, I think the technical people are often with us. They want to support us, they do the work, but what is missing is the politics, and it's the resources, and then just making sure that work does not just abruptly stop because someone at some point decided that UNITAD, needed to be over. So, yeah.
I also want to so now that UNITAD's mandate is ending and they'll close down in September, we shouldn't forget how much money has been put into UNITAD and that there will be a void. And how can we make sure that others are able to fill the void? And we're grateful for Ambassador Van Schaak's office for supporting Yazidi organizations like YASDA, like Free Yezidi Foundation, and but there will be a big void that needs to be filled, and we were really counting on UNITAD to do what it was necessary to do, and I feel now that it was a few years, and now we have to move on again. And you said like it's nice to see women doing the work, but it is very unfortunate to say that we as civil society had to pick up the slack that the international community did not do. We expected a tribunal. It didn't happen. We expected much more from the international community. We expected the ICC. In 2015, Murad and I went to the International Criminal Court to start prosecuting those ISIS members from member states. It didn't happen. So then the Yazidi community is just waiting for civil society to do what we can do. And it's compared to what the international community can do, what we do it's not a lot. Yeah. We're trying, but it's not. It doesn't fulfill the needs of our people.
And just maybe to add to that, when you look at Ukraine, I mean, not wanting to have any hierarchy of victims, but it actually does exist. Like, when you look how, and as an international lawyer, I observed this with a lot of curiosity, but also pain. Like, when you see how quickly the international community can activate all these different mechanisms, like ICC, ICJ, creating new ones, it's painful, because then you go back to your own community and you tell them, we're not important enough. In a way, this is the message that is being sent. Same for what's happening in Palestine. It's very, very painful to see. So depending on where you're from and your skin color and what you represent, Yazidis were invisible before 2014, and it feels sometimes right now that we still are. Of course, the name is, people know most of the time who Yazidis are. I mean, but except empathy, there is no concrete outcomes.
But I do believe that in Europe they'll see that their negligence of not reacting to what ISIS was will hurt them in the long run, because perpetrators have crossed the border. They've been through Turkey. Turkey has been an open gate for ISIS terrorists. They've gone through Turkey to Europe. They're now in Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and elsewhere. We will see terrorist attacks in those countries. Mark my words. It wasn't only in Iraq and Syria. It will happen in Europe as well, because there was no action. There was no proper action from the international community that was supposed to be there.
Well, I think you're highlighting, we are out of time, how much more there is to discuss on all of this, and even 10 years out, how much further we have to go to not only ensure justice, but really create the conditions to address the root causes of what happened, And so, really grateful for, I think, starting this conversation here today and looking forward to continuing the discussion. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to our audience and our participants, and definitely more to come. Thank you.
Thank you. You're the best. Biggest champion. Akila, thank you so much.
Thank you. I wanted to talk about how Iraq is the only country that consented, which is why you just had that.
Many thanks to our panelists. It was really, both panels were very informative, and they opened many horizons for more debate and more action, I hope, by the international community, by the government of Iraq, and all other people who are involved and interested. Now it's my pleasure and honor to introduce my colleague, Nabras Basatki, who is the Assistant Director at the Empower Me program here at the Atlantic Council, to give closing remarks before we conclude this day's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abbas. Many of you have heard throughout today's session that even after the decade, the Yezidi community continues to be impacted by the genocide campaign happened in 2014. 10 years have passed, yet the scars remain deep, with the community still facing tragic realities. First, half of the Yezidi population in Iraq is still internally displaced, and the families hope to return to their homeland in Sinjar one day. Second, 2,600 Yazidis are still missing, and their families live in constant pain and uncertainty. Just a reminder that each missing person is someone's loved ones, and every day passing with their absence is a heartache for the families that they endure every single day. Third, mass graves are yet to be exhumed, leaving families unable to bury their loved ones according to the traditions and with the dignity that they deserve. As of today, there are over 94 mass graves, and only 61 have been exhumed so far. Just another grim reminders of the horrors my community faced in 2014. Fourth, a generation of Yazidis have been lost, as we discussed throughout our sessions today, due to lack of access to education and employment opportunities. And I just want to remind her here that this has been happening decades before 2014, and 2014 genocide only exacerbated the situations for our youth. Lastly, Sinjar is still unsafe for the families to return to, yet we constantly hear from the Iraqi government plans to close those camps without ensuring their safe return. With over 70% of Sinjar's infrastructure destroyed, it's almost impossible for those displaced, traumatized families to return to Sinjar without having access to basic services such as water, electricity, healthcare, and let alone security that they deserve. Over the past week, Yazidi civil leaders gathered in Washington to remind the international community and the government officials that Yazidis still need justice and accountability. They want to ensure that tragedies like this never happen again in Iraq and around the globe. And today they gathered us here at the Atlantic Council. They're united in one mission. They came to demand the following. First, establish a new security agreement with actually this time Yazidis being involved in it. Create a federally mandated security force in Sinjar and depoliticize the security. Appoint an independent Yazidi mayor. Make Sinjar a separate government, as Nadia mentioned, to expedite the legal process that our communities have to endure on a daily basis. And implement a comprehensive investment plan for infrastructure and local employment. Second, today we heard throughout today the importance of establishing a UNITAD follow-up mechanisms to make sure that these secure evidence is safely stored, investigated, and ISIS supporters and members are persecuted not just in Iraq or in the US, but around the globe. Fourth, ensure a safe, voluntarily, and a dignified return for Yazidis to Sinjar. We've heard today from Murad Ismail that the Yazidis, the government has been using inhumane tactics such as closing down their stipends or reducing them in order to force them to return to a land that is no longer safe for them to thrive in. Fourth, the Iraqi government should prioritize processing Yazidi reparation claims, increasing their stipends to return, activate reconstruction projects in Sinjar and all around the area, and with that effort, just allocating 1% only of their annual budget to make Sinjar able to arrive for the people. Lastly, Iraqi government should establish, not just the Iraqi government, but the international community, establish a task force led by Yazidi civil societies, U.S. agencies, and relevant authorities to identify and rescue the missing Yazidis, and urgently exhume all the remaining mass graves so the families could bury their loved ones and be identified so they can process their reparations. My community has been discriminated against and persecuted long before 2014, with over 74 documented genocide in our known history. Ladies and gentlemen, survival is not enough. We've been strangers in our home for long enough. It's time for justice, accountability, and future. We're not merely surviving, but thriving in our homeland. We demand recognition, support, and action needed to rebuild our life and restore the dignity that was taken from us by ISIS in 2014. Just to end up, I wanted to thank the Free Yezidi Foundation for your collaboration and all for the Yezidi leaders who've gathered here with us, including Murad, Natia, and Perry. And thank you for the U.S. government officials who've joined us here as well. And thank you, everyone.